My name is Dominique Avery, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Can We Talk, an opportunity to have a wide-ranging conversation with just one interesting Simsbury resident. Today, my guest is the chairman of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, better known as PURA. Are your eyes starting to glaze over? Put down your remote, don't switch the channel. This is going to be interesting. PURA may be a bit on the dull side, but I promise you, if your interest lies in public affairs and politics, you will be happy you stayed. Here's just a taste of my guest's remarkable resume. He knows Washington well, having been chief of staff for former Connecticut Senator Abe Ribicoff. He worked for former Senator Chris Dodd as a specialist on international relations. He served on the staff of the National Security Council and was director of communications for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He also worked on President Obama's transition team, and he's run for office himself. He ran for state senate here in Simsbury. And furthermore, he's distantly related to the Enos. I'd like to introduce you now to Arthur House. Welcome. I have been eager to interview you for some time.
Thanks, Dominique. It's good to be here.
And that was a very long introduction, and I don't do that, but my goodness, you have a long resume.
Try to stay out of trouble.
Before we get into some more substantial issues, let me start with something quite a bit more simple. I saw that you were born in Manchester, Connecticut. I know you've spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. What brought you to Simsbury? And tell me a little bit about that. How did you end up here?
Well, yes, I'm from Manchester. Went off to college and graduate school. And then I went to Washington with the World Bank and some of the other things you mentioned. And when I came back, I liked the western part of Connecticut a lot. And I moved to Granby and East Granby in Simsbury. I liked this side of the river. And very simply, it was a place I like to live. My family went off to Texas to work for a large international corporation called Tenneco for a while. And then when we came back, we looked around, where are we going to find a home now that we're coming back? And I have to say, a lot of it was the school system here. We have 3 girls. They were all of school age. And Simsbury is a terrific town, and it also has excellent schools. So those kinds of factors were in there. Plus, I do have a bit of a rural background, having grown up in Manchester. It was out in the rural part of it, and I like staying out of a city if I can.
I'm also the co-chair of the Simsbury Tourism Committee, so I like to hear that. I like to hear good things about Simsbury, and what you say is true of so many people, that they really love it here. Okay, so now let's go back to something a little more, a little drier, PURA. You became chair of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, I think, in 2012.
That's right.
And for the completely uninitiated, tell us what PURA is and why it's important, sort of your elevator speech.
Sure. Well, very simply, in the United States, most public utilities are private companies, but they serve the public. And if you have a monopoly for something which is essential for life, for survival, you have to have some control over it. You don't have any choice as to whose pipes come into your house for water or whose wires come into your house to deliver electricity. It is a monopoly, and when there's a monopoly, there has to be some public oversight. So that's what we do. We oversee electricity, natural gas, water, and to a very limited extent, some telecommunications.
PURA, so some of the things that people might know about PURA that might impact them sort of most immediately. I recall in December you announced that there was going to be another area code.
Yes, that took place, and the presentation was given to us. We saw that it was all in order, and so we approved it. But the kinds of things we do are electricity rates. Now, the law provides that a company must have the right to try to earn a profit and to meet its expenses. So they come to us for rate increases, and a lot of people feel upset that I haven't had a salary increase. How can they have a rate increase? Well, the law is if they have made expenditures which are necessary and used and useful, then they have the right to recoup those. So for example, if there's a labor rate increase or they have to buy new trucks, they can recoup those costs. And what we do is to review the submissions to see if they're used and useful. We also look at reliability. There's a lot of work done. This is the former, most people think of Pure as the former DPUC.
UC, right.
But after the big storms of 2011, we did a lot of work on reliability. Every so often there's a rate increase for water, in the accessibility of natural gas. These are all issues that are currently before us. We recently had a merger. The United Illuminating has merged with Iberdrola, a large Spanish company, and we turned them down last June. We decided they were not in the public interest, and we said why, and they resubmitted and met the qualifications and the objections that we had raised, and two of the three commissioners approved the merger the second time around.
So another issue where I think you've made news had to do with the cutting of trees, which also had to do with reliability and storms. I recall reading some upset that too many trees were being cut down by the electric companies.
That's true. And I guess one should never be surprised by an issue in the public domain. But about over 90% of all outage, aside from those caused by squirrels who chew through wires, are because trees fall down and they come down on top of wires.
We know that well here in Simsbury.
We know that well here in Simsbury, that's right. I was without power for about 10 days in 2011. Know that well. Well, you have to trim the trees, and there are guidelines for that as to what you trim and what you can't trim. The utilities, if there's a tree on private property, they have to notify the owner, and the owner can object, and the owner can go to the local tree warden to have this adjudicated. And the reaction in different parts of Connecticut was very interesting. In some of the more rural towns, they're saying, would you please come out here and cut the trees down? We don't want any power out. And by the way, leave the wood at the side of the road, and we'll come by in our pickup trucks and put it in our wood-burning stoves. And the more of this you can do, the better. You get some other towns, New Haven and Hamden are some in particular, where there was an aggressive application of the rules and a real fear, because if you had a street where all the trees were next to the wires, the solution might have been to take down all the trees. Well, that affects real estate values and so forth. So you have to be reasonable about it. And but yes, the trimming of trees, people cannot stand being without cell phone use, which happens when you don't have electricity, or without power. But they're also very attached to their trees, and we have to make sure that in proceeding this, we're using common sense, obeying the law, and that we're fair and reasonable.
Okay, so now Art, you are sitting here talking to me, and you're talking English. But if anybody watches any of these hearings on television, they are extraordinarily technical. And I think the ordinary person, I used to watch a lot of them because I worked at the CTN, the state television network, and we covered a lot of Pura hearings in those days. I don't think they cover as many now. But it's very hard for the ordinary person to understand because it's a lot of technical issues, right?
It is. I must say that we have an excellent communication staff, and they speak English, and they speak understandable English. And they're available to discuss people who have issues with their utilities. But this is decided by law, and there are statutes, and there are technical terms, and there are economic terms.
Right.
When you get into a rate case, you get into depreciation, you get into tax law, you get into recoverability. So, yes, to be fair, often you have to be very, very technical, and you have to follow the rules and the law. And I do everything I can to try to make this understandable.
Okay, so I have not seen never seen you either at a meeting or at a hearing. So I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about,
but when people come in, I want to make them feel at home. And especially if they don't have an attorney, to explain to them what the rules are and what's going on. And whenever we have a rate case, we have an outreach. We go out into the community to hear from people who come and ask us questions.
You actually go out in the community.
We go out in the community.
So things have changed.
Well, I can't say what it was like before I was there, but yes, we do. And right now, we're also going out and having what we call outreach meetings to explain the suppliers, because now you can, since we deregulated, you can choose your own.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you
about. Well,
about.
I'll let you ask about that, but we are having outreach meetings where we go out and explain that system because it's quite complicated.
Yeah, so that's what people find extremely confusing, and people will say, well, if there's just one group of wires, how can there be people, lots of companies selling the same power? So how do you answer that when somebody asks you a question, a basic question like that? They just can't figure it out.
The answer is more complex than the question which you posed.
I'm telling you what people have said.
You stated it quite simply and quite eloquently. It's exactly what it is. Connecticut decided years ago to distinguish between the generation of electricity and the distribution. The distributors are, in this part of the world, Eversource. Down along the coastline between New Haven and Bridgeport, it's United Illuminating, which is now a Vanguard. It's a new company under Iberdrola. So
Evander?
A Vangrid, I believe it's called. A Vangrid is its new.
That's a new one. Yeah.
Used to be called United Illuminating. So there's only one set of wires coming into the house, one distribution company. But those who generate and sell electricity, it's now deregulated. So a lot of people can do that. There are about 40 companies licensed in Connecticut to sell electricity. Now, at the same time, a number of people just say it's too complicated and I would rather just go with the standard offer. Now, what the standard offer is a system managed by, in this part of the country, in this part of the state, Eversource, and down there by Avangrid. And they take bids. It's an auction. So what people say is, it may not be the lowest cost, but certainly not the highest cost, and it's the result of an auction, and it's for 6 months at a time, and it's overseen by a public authority, which is us. So the supplier market, you can save money on it, and if you understand it and you get into it, it can be to your advantage. But it's not for everyone.
Because you have to pay close attention to.
You have to pay close attention. Now it goes for 4 months at a time, but it can change. It can go up and down. And I guess that's just it. If you pay attention, you know what it's all about, and you get yourself educated, you can save some money on it. For a number of people, over 50% still use standard or have gone back to standard offer because it's understandable, right. It's steady, and it is overseen by a public authority.
And you don't have to pay attention. It's just...
It's there.
Right. Now I still have the standard offer. Before you became chairman of PURA, you mentioned before the DPUC, Governor Malloy and the legislature folded the Department of Public Utilities Control into a new agency with the Department of Environmental Protection. And I remember reading, maybe it was last year or the year before, that you and the other directors of PURA had some concerns about being folded into that agency, and I think you were asking for independence back, and as I recall, the governor was not too happy with. So what happened there? And
I had a good, candid conversation with the governor. The situation, we made it work. He made it clear he would like to have the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority within DEEP, and so we said, fine, that's how we'll proceed, that's how we'll do it. And we've made it work. In our adjudication, in hearing of cases, we are completely independent. So that as part of the overall DEEP effort, we're willing to and can contribute to that. But when we sit down to adjudicate a case, it's only the 3 commissioners. It's like a court, and that court renders its decision independent of anybody else. So the system works.
One of the previous commissioners of the DPUC, Don Downs, used to testify at the legislature a lot. Is that also part of your job?
It's part of my job. I try to go when needed or when invited rather than hang around a lot. I used to work in the U.S. Senate in Washington, and I used to sometimes manage testimony and have senators pose their questions, and I realized that you should show up when you're needed, when you have something important to say. And I try to behave that way up there too. Yes, occasionally I go up. This is a short session right now. Right. They only have 3 months to get things done. If they need me, I'm there. One of the things that I have been working on especially is cybersecurity. We have a report coming out on that, and that may require me to go up to the hill, as they say, and to discuss that particular report. But yes, certainly do testimony, but it depends also on what the agenda of the legislature is.
Right. Yeah, I just read the other day somebody's introduced a bill to legalize marijuana. So we'll see if we'll see what happens to
Not
that.
something likely to come before us.
Not at all. So another thing that Pura oversees that you touched on before is cable TV and other video services, and also community access. You are sitting in a community access television station. I'd love your views on the impact of public access, how important you think they are, and what you think their future is.
Sure. It is very loosely regulated. The law does provide that certain amount of money that comes from your cable television bill go to public access television, and we see that that takes place. Secondly, when there are funds for capital improvements from the legislature, public access television stations apply to Pura and for capital grants, and we make those as well. But to get to your question, I think it's critical. One of the Americans I worked for that I really admired and think had a lasting effect was John Gardner. John Gardner wrote books on leadership and self-renewal. He was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He was a Republican who worked for Lyndon Johnson as Secretary of HEW. He created the White House Fellows Program. He created Common Cause and several other programs. Remarkable man. I was at one of the last public speeches he ever gave, and someone asked the question, what do you think is today the most important challenge facing the United States? And he was very decided on that. He said, it's the declining sense of community. We know more about somebody on our smartphone than our next door neighbor. We know more about what's going on our favorite website than we do for our Board of Education or our Board of Directors. This disengagement from our community is dangerous, and I agree with them. Now, how do you communicate? How do you keep a community going? Public access television is one of the key ways to do it. So I think it not only does it help with education, help with awareness, and help with citizenship. I think its ability to allow people to understand what's going on in their community, to have a sense of community, is absolutely paramount. So I think it's critical not only to have a good, healthy community, but for the strength of the United States.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's one of the reasons in my retirement, am spending so much time here. And one of the reasons that I think Simsbury is as extraordinary a community as it is, because this public access station was created in 1984, and I think has made a tremendous difference in terms of this sense of community. It has a sense of community, it has a lot of other things, but this is part of it. And for me, I'm interviewing myself, I just think it's really important that people have access to their government and can see when things happen. For instance, when the Mary Glassman thing happened, they could see it on television. And Avon and Simsbury chose to be an independent. Our little group of 6 stations in this area, in this Comcast area, chose to be independent, which means we're a lot poorer. But I think we're far better off than Avon, which is part of a consortium of 11 towns. And Farmington, for instance, Board of Education just began taping their Board of Ed meetings now. And we've been doing it since 1984. I think that makes a difference.
Those who care watch. I think it's very high quality. I'm biased, I watch. And yes, I think it is essential to have a strong community, and I think you do a terrific job.
So what I say is, even if now I'm making a speech for SCTV, but even if you never watch us, even if you never look at anything on our website, we are there, and in a crisis we will be there, and it's like water. It's got to be there when you turn on the tap. So I am very disturbed that the state has swept the funds for technological improvements, and it doesn't look. I'm sure you'll agree with me. It doesn't look like there's going to be any change in that this year.
Connecticut has a very severe budget crisis right now, structural. It's much different than it has been for the last 5 or 6 years. So, yes, anything that involves cost is under scrutiny.
So we are
for the capital funds, the ongoing cost to keep the station going. The ongoing funds, the ordinary budget, is of course intact.
But because technology technology changes so much. You have to keep up, and it wears out. So we
Yeah.
are right now, we've gotten a grant, and we're about to begin a matching grant fundraising. I forget what it's called now, but we're going to begin fundraising for this capital fund because we need to replace some equipment that we otherwise would have paid for with PEG-PESHA funds. from the state.
Well, I think that's right. I would not bet on PEG-PESHA funds, which are those capital funds we
We're
referred
not
to
counting on them.
coming through. So, all right, so you have to have a capital
Okay,
campaign.
I'm going to get off my
Fine,
soapbox.
fine.
As I mentioned earlier, you were Chief of Staff for former Connecticut Senator Ribicoff. I'm dying to hear a little bit about that as well. And you also worked for former Senator Chris Dodd as a specialist on international relations. The Senate was very different then. What do you think when you see what's going on there now?
It was. I had a third job in the Senate. I was also Chief
Right.
of Staff to the Senate Majority Leader, and I used to run
Right.
the floor operations.
Oh, I didn't know.
Senator Ribicoff's closest friend, personal friend, Sunday night get together and have dinner together, was Howard Baker, the minority leader, the Republican minority leader.
Really?
Yes. I mean, personal friend. When Senator Ribicoff went to the floor of the Senate for his bill, because he was chairman of the Government Affairs Committee, excuse me, he always went with Charles Percy, the senator from Illinois, and they presented it together. It was their bill. And I was walking back from the Senate floor with him one day, and I asked him, "Are you pleased, Senator? How do you think it went?" And it was one of the many lessons I learned from him. He looked at me and said, "Look, Arthur, I got 75% of what I wanted. Chuck Percy got 25%, and yeah, I didn't get everything, but I got my bill through. And Chuck Percy got some things that are very important to him. That's how it's supposed to be." Well, that kind of bipartisanship is just it's not even heard of anymore. So yes, I find it extremely disappointing. To take it to the national level, since we're in the middle of a presidential campaign, after Ronald Reagan was elected president, it was November. It was November, early December. And he sent word he wanted to have lunch with the Senate Democrats. So I was Chief of Staff to the Majority Leader, so we had lunch, and I was allowed in. And he knew that he would not have a successful presidency if he did not have a working relationship with the minority in the Senate. Absolutely essential to do that. And so he came and had lunch with them. Senator Patrick Moynihan of New York arranged a toast, and the Senate Democrats toasted the Ronald Reagan, and the toast was, "To the success of your presidency." Now, we'll fight you on certain things, we'll cooperate on certain things, but if you turn it around, do you really want to have a president of the United States who is an unsuccessful president? Well, of course not. Now, that basic respect, that meeting, you just won, but we'll work with you when we can. That camaraderie, that sense that the nation demands cooperation where there's common ground, and that we both need to try to create common ground, that's the huge difference I see, and it's very unhealthy. I mean, when President Obama was elected, the Senate minority leader at the time announced that his goal was to defeat...
Exactly, the next day.
The next thing was to defeat President Obama, to make sure he had an unsuccessful presidency and have him be replaced in 4 years. Right out of the box. I mean, now, it exists on both sides. I'm not being partisan here. I'm just saying that attitude in Washington that we are the good guys, whoever you are, they are the bad guys, and that we will not cooperate, I think is not only makes it less fun to be in politics, I think it's not good for the country.
Have you? I'm assuming that you've thought about this. I mean, what happened?
That's a long story, and a lot of thoughts about it. One is finance, one is the media. Again, to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he used to say that we're all entitled, everyone is entitled to an opinion. Your opinion is whatever you want it to be, but you're not entitled to your own facts. The facts are the facts, and we need to start with a common base. We don't start with a common base anymore. You go from from Fox to MSNBC or your favorite blog and so forth. But there are people who meet who are absolutely certain that their version of the truth is the truth, and that the other side's version is untrue. It is not factual. It is not accurate. So you don't talk about your opinion as to what should be happening going forward, because you never agree actually on what the facts are to begin with. I think that is a huge problem. Another one is congressional districts. You look at some of them, and it's enough to make you angry. They follow a highway. They have absolutely nothing to do with something that looks like a square or a circle. They are weird shapes, and they are designed so that one party is absolutely assured of winning this seat and another party of that seat. And if that's the case, if there's no real contest in a district, then there is little incentive for a congressman or congresswoman
to reach across the aisle.
To reach across the aisle, or even to try to please people other than their own party. Their only fear is a primary, not. So therefore, you get extremism comes in, because they don't have to worry in an election of losing it to the other party. So there are a number of reasons. Money is a third. So I mean, just to throw out
Money
three
meaning
reasons.
the Supreme Court decision, or?
Citizens United, but also simply the advantage of incumbency. When I worked in Washington, it was considered very bad form to raise money if you were a United States Senator until the 2 years before your election. You had a 6-year term. The first 4 years, let the candidates raise money. It's just considered bad form to go out and ask for money. Now you get elected and you start immediately
Raising money, yeah.
And by the time an incumbent senator comes to those 2 years, frequently there's millions of dollars already in the bank. And Congress people do the same thing.
And that's also corrupting.
Well, you spend so much time asking for money. It makes the job much less pleasant. They don't like doing it, but it also makes it very difficult for the citizen politician to decide, I'll run. If you run, you have to you have to raise a huge amount of money just to be a viable candidate.
Right, well, yeah, I mean, we have 2 senators in our state now, one of whom has access to quite a bit of, has been easily raising money, and the other who's quite poor, who is not a wealthy man, and I think he spends a lot of time always asking for money.
Every United States senator has to raise money.
I suppose Senator Blumenthal does too, even though he has quite a bit of money himself. So you tried your hand at running for office yourself.
Yes, sure. It's a great sport.
One time or more than once?
No. When I came back from Washington, in 1984, I ran for Congress. I just really love politics.
Okay, so I missed that election, so I didn't know you ran, because I was in New Jersey at the time. So you ran in 1984.
1984, I ran against an incumbent. 98% of all incumbents were getting reelected, but the 2 things you don't tell, they say it could be a man or a woman. One is don't run for office, and the other is don't get married. If they want to go do it, they do. Yeah, I had fun. I enjoyed it.
So was that for the 5th or the
It was
6th?
then the 6th,
6th
now the 5th.
district, right.
It was...
Was Nancy Johnson there
Nancy
already?
Johnson was the incumbent, and it was what they called the Reagan landslide of 1984. We had a party lever in Connecticut back then.
Right.
People forget about that. So I had almost exactly the same number of votes as Walter Mondale. People go in and they vote for one or the other. But it's a terrific experience. I think people ought to run for office. Usually when you take on an incumbent at the federal level, you're probably not going to win, but the experience is worthwhile. I think people ought to go out and run for office. Give it a good shot. It's fun. You learn a lot, and it's good for the system when you get fresh blood in there.
So you tried again.
I did. That was just a couple years ago.
Right.
I ran in the 8th senatorial district, which has never. I'm a Democrat. Never had a Democrat, Again, that was a lot of fun. Got 48%, so that wasn't bad. I'm really pleased that I carried Simsbury. That meant a lot to me.
I loved your the campaign slogan, your House for Senate.
House for Senate. Those lawn signs. Sure,
I thought that was really cute. And,
no regrets. I mean, it is fun to go out and meet with people, find out what's on their mind, engage. I mean, you really do have a sense of what's going on in the world when you go out, and it's a form of making yourself vulnerable. And when people rally around and help you out, it's terrific. And as I say, I'm grateful to Simsbury for having
Having-
at least I carried my hometown.
Any thoughts about running again?
Not
Since
right
you liked
now.
it so much?
Not right now. You know, what they say about politicians, they're like the firehouse dog. When they hear the bell, they always perk up. But no, I'm enjoying being the chairman of Pura right now.
So I also read somewhere that you chaired Jepson's for governor's campaign.
Yes.
And you have a special relationship with Attorney General Jepson.
That's right. Often when I'm on television, the person in your chair starts out with full disclosure.
Oh.
That's right. Yes, George Jepson, the Attorney General, is my brother-in-law. And the story there was, I came back after Chris Dodd had been elected, and we had an event in Connecticut to help repay some of the campaign expenses. And I came up for that, and I met this young fellow who was very interesting, George Jepson, and we became friends. And he's very bright, very capable guy. And he never told me he had a sister. I found out about that from my campaign manager when I was running for Congress then. He said, you know, George has got a terrific sister. And so that's how I met her. People say, oh, what a great thing your buddy George Jepson did. Nonsense. I had to find out that the good-looking part of the family was through my campaign manager. So, yes, and Rita's his sister, and we live right over here on East Weetog Street and have 3 daughters.
So, well, that's full disclosure. I'm sure there are a lot of people in Simsbury who don't know that. And I
Well-
certainly didn't know that that was how you met your wife. I had no idea how that relationship came about. So now we've touched on politics and a little bit on the Senate. Maybe we should talk about what's happening in this quite remarkable primary season. We're recording this on February 12th, a couple of days after the New Hampshire primary, and this is going to still be airing after the South Carolina primary. But maybe you'd like to share some of your thoughts about what is going on in this extraordinary year.
Yes, some thoughts. Now, to be clear, I cannot endorse a candidate. I cannot be engaged in politics. I can observe as to what's going on. To me, one of the really interesting things is the alienation from Washington, this anger that has been arisen on both sides, especially on the Trump candidacy on the Republican side and on Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side. And the weakness of the parties. You fund your own campaign, you go out and do it yourself now. And this dissatisfaction with Washington, with politics as usual, is really remarkable. I think a lot of the expectations and the rules of the road are just
Out the
being
window.
redefined. I've never met anyone who can honestly say a year ago that Bernie Sanders would be giving a serious run at the
Right.
candidacy on the Democratic
Donald
side.
Trump.
Or Donald Trump.
I
I
know.
mean, everyone is surprised. Everyone is I think, well, just that. They're surprised. And there is among both establishments a certain amount of alarm as to what do we do now. Other countries, I will tell you this, when I deal with people from other countries, they don't quite know what to make of it. I mean, they learned their history, they learn about the American political system, and now this comes along and they're generally confused about it. So who knows what's going to happen? But yes, the one thing I do find concerning is this, is the disenchantment. What I find is encouraging the number of young people who are involved. That's great. When you see people really enthusiastic in getting out and getting engaged in politics, I think, we've always, the future of the United States, the ability to get involved, to go out and decide I am going to become involved in a campaign, it's extremely healthy. And that's one of the things I think we can take heart from.
Anything else?
Any particular questions? One of the things I'm especially concerned about is national security and foreign affairs. And it's interesting that has taken a bit of a backseat to so many of the domestic issues in this campaign, perhaps understandably. But sooner or later, somebody does become president and then has to consider what is our national security and define a policy. And that will be very different depending on who gets elected.
Does it worry? I mean, well, maybe you should talk a little bit about what your involvement in national security, that you were on the staff of the National Security Council and Director of Communications for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which was formed after 9/11
Right.
as an oversight over all the intelligence
Yes, right.
agencies. So I think you probably know quite a bit about what's going on. What happens after an election? I mean, let's say Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders were to win. Neither one of them knows much about anything.
Well, I've been part of two transitions.
Right.
And one of the things that happens is that the people who are in the White House or in the party in power generally have a very patriotic sense. They want to share what they've worked on because it means something to them. They may have spent 4 years, 8 years, and they want to share with the incoming people. Here's my file on this. Here's what we did on this. You'll need this background and all that because they've invested so much of their lives into all this, and they want that to carry on to be part of the future. The people coming in usually have absolutely no interest in what the people who are leaving did. Thanks for the file. And by the way, when is your desk going to be free? Because I need to get in here and get started. The incoming people don't want to hear about it. They want to start afresh. And they're going to do wonderful things, very often extremely optimistic. And I've seen this a couple times now, and it's always that same way. I was part of the Obama transition. Well, the two very simple, very different jobs. At the National Security Council, I was an assistant to Henry Kissinger and to Brent Scowcroft, and our job was to take the policy recommendations that came from the government and send them up to the president. And my job was I was the last reader to make sure everything was in the file. And if the president was going to be asked to sign a letter or to agree to something, that it be written, that the English be absolutely tight. And also if there was an intelligence briefing, that everything be in the briefing file. So that was my job. I did that, and as a fairly young fellow, and was in my 30s, it was eye-opening and very exciting. The second job I just did a couple of years ago with the Director of National Intelligence. After 9/11, we understood that we knew about these people who committed the acts against the World Trade Center, the bombings, well, also down in Pennsylvania. But if you look at it, certain intelligence agencies knew that there are people here learning how to fly planes. Others had communications intelligence, knowing that somebody was trying to get into the United States. They didn't, as they say, connect the dots is one of the terms used. It wasn't integrated. So the effort was to try to do more integration of intelligence, bring it all together. It's been a partial success. There is now more communication. The agencies still have some rivalries, and so it's still a work in progress. But again, you take heart from the young people. Young people who go in to work in signals intelligence or geospatial intelligence or human intelligence, they want to share. They already do it online. They already do it with their smartphones. And for them, the thought of, oh no, you can't share this because he or she works for a different agency, it makes no sense. It's all here, let's integrate it, bring it together. So I think we're headed in the right direction, and some of the old rivalries from the old intelligence agencies where historically the CIA and the FBI have not gotten along well together, and within the intelligence community some other rivalries. Younger people don't have much interest in that or much use for it. So I think we are getting more integrated, and the final product is for the good of the safety of the American people.
So is there too much intelligence gathering, like Snowden said? I mean, he, and what do you think of what he did and what the impact was there?
Well, when you gather intelligence, you need to protect privacy. And when you gather intelligence, you don't know what's going to be there. If, for example, you're watching a sensitive part of the world, you don't know what might happen, and it may be relevant, it may not. If you're listening to a group of people you suspect of terrorism, you may get important communications between a potential threat and somebody in the United States, or you may get simply a conversation which is about what they're going to have for dinner that night. I mean, you don't know when you're collecting intelligence what's there. The trick is to protect the privacy of the United States, of American citizens. Right. And I can say when I was there, that they took that extremely seriously, that anything that related to an American citizen, you could not pursue it without a court order. So that, frankly, people in Washington were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, as far as my own personal experience was concerned. Now, you have to do two things. You cannot spy on Americans. That's against the law. Secondly, you want to keep them safe. You want to prevent homegrown terrorism or terrorism with a link overseas from striking in the United States. So that's a tension, and it's going to exist for some time. And I think we have to recognize that there is a legitimate need on both sides of that, whatever that conflict, and to manage it going forward. As far as Snowden is concerned, when you go into intelligence, you swear an oath of office that you'll defend the Constitution of the United States, you will protect the secrets, that you are going to behave in a certain way and you'll obey the law. And I think you have to do that. I've taken that oath a few times. And for somebody to come in and unilaterally to decide, I don't like the system, so therefore I'm going to spill the beans and tell a whole bunch of secrets, you can't operate that way. I mean, I understand frustration, and I understand the system is imperfect, but you simply cannot operate an intelligence system, which is necessary in a dangerous world, if you're going to decide, I will now become the decider as to what becomes made public and what not. So I find it very difficult to support somebody like Snowden. And frankly, I think what he did was very, very dangerous, and people have suffered because of it.
So we didn't go to where, let's say, a Trump or a Bernie Sanders is now elected. And what happens to them? I mean, are their eyes opened? Do they get private briefings that tell them exactly what we know? Are they shocked? I mean, was Obama? Do you think Obama was shocked by secrets that were known? Or I have no idea. I'm just speculating here.
Good question. Once an individual becomes the nominee of a party, he or she receives an intelligence briefing. I mean, I know some of the briefers who've done that. Now, obviously for Hillary Clinton, she already knows this. She's been Secretary of State. Senator Sanders has had the right to have access to certain intelligence as a United States Senator. Obviously, Trump has not. Senator Cruz and some of the others. I mean, it depends on what your job has been. In the Senate, you can have certain limited access to intelligence. Once you become the nominee, you get an intelligence briefing. And the point is that no one should run for office at a disadvantage. So it would be unfair, for example, to have one candidate who had an intelligence background, knew what all the threats were, what all the secrets were, and another who had absolutely no idea of what was going on. So once you become the official nominee, the intelligence community come visit you. They will bring a briefing book. They will tell you what's going on in the world. They'll ask you if there are any particular areas that you need to know more about, and they will brief you. And you are sworn to maintain those secrets for the rest of your life. But yes, they are made available to both. Now let's take it one step farther. Whoever gets elected, one of the first things you do is you put together a team. And nobody is elected President of the United States an expert in economics, agriculture, defense, information technology, law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you're in charge of everything. Right. So for any of these fields, including national security, you have to bring in some good people. You have to delegate to them and trust them. You have to tell them what your priorities are. You have to ask for briefings on those priorities. You have to put a team together. And we've seen differing degrees of success in this. Sometimes you never have a team. Sometimes the team works very, very well together. I think one of the best instances of careful and effective management of national security was in President George H.W. Bush. Why? Because he had been vice president, he had been with the CIA, he knew how the system works. When I was a youngster, I used to sit in on the morning call that Brent Scowcroft would run. And he had the Secretary of Defense, head of the CIA, Secretary Kissinger, and sometimes others on the phone for the 9 o'clock call. And President Bush was then at the CIA, he participated in that call. He knew how important it was to have a team. And he brought with him Scowcroft, who had already been National Security Advisor once before. He had brought in Robert Gates, who also was very experienced in this. So you had players who knew what the roles were and what was expected. Others come in brand new to all of this, and they have to do it on their own. It's very important who you choose, how you manage that team, and who you listen to. So those crucial first couple of months are very, very important, both to understand what the roles will be, but also to let your team know what's important to you and what your priorities are going to be.
So you have a candidate now, Ted Cruz, who talks about carpet bombing and, sort of turning the desert radioactive, or I forget what he said, some extreme thing. To me, he clearly has no idea of what it looks like actually in these areas and how ISIS is commingled with ordinary citizens and what that means. How is he able to choose a team that people can trust if he has so much ignorance about?
Well, Dominique, as you can probably tell, I'm trying to stay out of the politics
Yes,
of
I
this.
know. Well, so
no. I'm just so
I know
I
you
can't
are,
talk
right.
about the specific candidates and their policies, but I can talk about process.
Right.
And what I will tell you is that when someone becomes president of the United States, suddenly there's an avalanche of people who want to go to work for you. The people you first turn to normally are those you've worked with on the campaign. Nobody running for office after you get the nomination can proceed without having experts in several fields around you. Whether it's the candidate you mentioned or anybody else, you have people there to advise you. When you have debates, these are the key issues. These are the talking points. And then after you get elected, the reason you get elected in November and take office in January was it used to take a long time to hitch up the horses and make your way to Washington. Right. And in European countries now, you get elected and the next day the next couple of days you take office. During that period, November, December, and January, that's when the team comes together, and that's when. So the candidate you mentioned, he or she will have a team. They will come together, and they immediately have to start priorities. They have to start vetting propositions. They have to start setting priorities and deciding what they're going to do. So whether you come in experienced or not, the system is set up so that you will learn. People will gather around you, and they'll help you to set your priorities and move forward.
So there was a candidate not so long ago who said in a debate that he would waterboard and more. Now, I think that you had something to do with this area. So what is your reaction when you hear something like that? I mean, this went against our law. Or it was very complicated, I know, but.
Yeah.
So just sitting at home, and I'm not talking about the specific candidate, but sitting at home, what was your reaction? If you watched the debate, what was your reaction when you heard that?
Yeah.
What did you say to your wife?
My reaction came from having gone into intelligence when President Obama became president. President Obama decided that, he looked at this very carefully, and what we found, and I was involved in that we did not learn things from waterboarding torture that you can't learn from other means. After a certain point, somebody will tell you anything. And a lot of the confessions that are made, a lot of the information that is made, is just made so that the torture will stop. So that as a means of obtaining information, torture is not effective. There are far more effective ways of doing that, of obtaining information. Secondly, the president decided not to go against the people who had engaged in activity that some have considered to be illegal, such as waterboarding and other forms of torture. What happened. He made it clear this is not going to happen, and the term was not on my watch. And the behavior will be according to American values. Now, that was considered controversial. We are now on February, 12th today. Just this past week, the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, was asked about this by Senator McCain. Senator McCain was tortured in the Vietnam War, and he obviously has very strong and understandably strong personal views on all this. And what Clapper said was the United States will abide by the Army Field Manual on Interrogation, and that sets limits, which have been followed by the United States all the way up until that episode, right, and has been followed ever since. There are methods for interrogating which are permitted and methods which are not. Waterboarding is not, and I think that has now been accepted as the standard we should adhere to, and it's one that I personally think is appropriate. The United States has gone to war several times. because we believe in certain basic dignity of life, certain human values. And we're always pleased to go to war because we were going to stop some of the atrocities that were taking place. I think we do not need to engage in a process which has not produced value to us in pursuing our national security. So that's my view on it, and I say that with a certain amount of emotion for having been involved in it.
So we are now in an international, in a mess right now. Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, it's just a total mess there. I'm not going to get into how we're going to solve that problem. I haven't the slightest idea. But what has happened is this problem of refugees. And I know you were involved in the UN, and I'm assuming you have some thoughts about what can be done. It's just the suffering is just so unbelievable on every level. And what can we do? I just look at it and I feel helpless.
Well, you're not alone.
I know.
The tens of thousands of refugees that are coming out, especially of Syria, have had a huge effect on Europe and even the countries of goodwill. I'm thinking of Sweden, Germany, and some others which were very welcoming to bring them in, have now reached a limit whereby they're saying, I'm not sure how many more refugees we can accept. The lesson you learn from it is I think, the following. Americans do not like to get involved in foreign conflicts, understandably. And yet, few things of value happen in the world without American initiative. Secretary Kerry has recently said this. So whether we like it or not, to be absent from a conflict sometimes means that it gets much worse and it reaches this stage. And that's one of the consequences of being the preeminent world power. If we are actively engaged in the Middle East, we create controversy. If we're not, things may just break wide open as they have right now. Now, a lot of Americans just like to stay out. But staying out also has huge consequences. And where does all this begin? I mean, one of the starting places was the Iraq War, just to begin with. I think one of the most profound mistakes since World War II. And once that fell apart, then you have Assad in there.
If you break it, you own it.
You break it, you own it. Colin Powell made that point. Well, back to your question. Yes, Turkey has a huge burden on it right now as the bordering state. And when they come into Turkey, they try to get to Greece. From Greece, they go into Northern Europe. We're going to be dealing with this for years to come, and it's a huge, huge problem. I think people coming to the United States, we need to do our fair share. People of course, are concerned. You don't want people with a terrorist background in, so you have to vet them. But every country of the world now has a problem, and you do two things: deal with the refugee problem at the same time that you try to solve the problem at the source. And I must say, the Russian involvement on behalf of Assad. They're killing a lot of people. They're not helping at all by backing up Assad. So, I mean, it's easy to find bad guys. It's easy to find bad guys, and I put the Russians in that situation. The solution is going to be very painful and going to take a long time. Unfortunately, when things get to this stage of really falling apart with no effective civilian government and massive suffering in the wintertime in a country like Syria, there's no easy solution, and it's one you're absolutely right that not only the United Nations, but Europe, the United States, and other countries are going to be coping with for a long time to come.
So does the UN lack the ability to help? Are they out of funds? What can people begin to do?
The United Nations has a High Commissioner of Refugees. They depend on contributions from other countries, and other countries are giving some contributions. The problem is, obviously, they're overwhelmed. I mean, something like this happens. You have refugee camps right now in Somalia, which have existed for 3 generations. The need far exceeds the resources, and it has become an issue, a political issue, in a lot of European countries. The United Nations does a lot of really terrific work, and they're allowed in sometimes when another country is not, because They are considered to be neutral, nonpartisan, and there for a specific solution. They do terrific work. Yes, they're extremely overwhelmed right now. They are getting resources, but they're not keeping up with the flow of refugees.
So, what do you personally do? You have any idea of what can be done to begin to solve this problem? I mean, you're not there. You're a Pura, but you know about all of these things. When you sit there, you read your paper, and you think, gee, if I were there, I would be doing so and so, or.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I worked in this field quite a bit. Senator Ribicoff went to the Middle East right after Jimmy Carter had been elected president. I went with him and met with Golda Meir, with President Sadat, and realized there was the kernel, there was the material was there for a peace agreement. He was immediately denounced back in the United States as being naive and a dreamer, but it worked. We went to see Secretary Vance and President Carter, wrote up the report. His friend Howard Baker was the other, there were 12 senators, wrote it up, and that report became the basis of what became the Camp David Peace Agreement. So if you look at what is possible, you listen to both sides, and then you bring some power down, because neither the Egyptians nor the Israelis wanted to proceed.
Right.
We said, you're going to proceed. Jimmy Carter held them captive at Camp David, wouldn't let them go, and forced concessions that eventually reached a peace agreement which both sides embraced. So it can be done. Yes, it can be done. I mean, without taking this apart, taking too much time, Iraq was a massive mistake. We went into Afghanistan with the intention not of doing counterterrorism, but counterinsurgency. We're going to win the hearts and minds. That will take hundreds of billions of dollars in 20, 30 years. I mean, it was I think, a naive set of assumptions, both those countries. And in the meantime, because of that, nobody wanted to get involved in Syria. We're an exhausted country.
Exactly.
We've had enough of this. So I think that going forward, we have to be selective, and we have to, when we do commit to something, we have to really put the resources in and see it to the end, or else we'll have more failed situations.
So it's hard for me to believe, but we have talked for almost an hour and our time is up. I just want to thank you for coming. It was worth the wait. It's been very interesting. I think I could have talked with you for a lot longer.
No, thank you, Dominique. As a watcher of the program, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for having me.
Well, you do watch.
Of course.
Oh, I'm very pleased. I'm very excited. So I just want to thank you for joining us as well, the public. And you can watch this show on SCTV on television. You can also watch it on our website. And if you would do me a favor and like us on Facebook, I would appreciate it, and tell your friends to like us as well. Thank you once again. Thank you, Kristen Benedict, for doing the cameras and the editing and the directing. And have a good day, and see you next time on Can We Talk?
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.